It gives me great pleasure to interview our speaker today, uh, whose presentation is entitled Radical Wāhine of Honolulu, 1945. This event is co-sponsored by Hamilton Library, the Hawaii Nui Akea School of Hawaiian Knowledge, Hui Aina Pilipili, the Native Hawaiian Institute, the Spark M. Matsunaga Institute for Peace and Conflict Resolution, the School of Cinematic Arts, the School of Communication and Information, and the Departments of Anthropology, History, and Women and Gender and Sexuality Studies. As the poster indicates, Mari Matsuda is an artist and one of the foundational writers of critical race theory and intersectional feminism. She is also a proud graduate of Roosevelt High School, the University of Hawaii at Mānoa's William S. Richardson School of Law, and more recently, the Art Department. She is the first tenured female Asian American law professor in the United States, and she has served on the faculty of UCLA and Georgetown before returning to Richardson here in Hawaii in 2008. She's a self-described activist scholar. She's generally considered to be one of the most important legal authorities on such topics as critical race theory, affirmative action, and reparations. I, however, would like to mention a few other things of special interest to those interested in life writing and in Hawaii, because she has made major contributions here as well. Today's seminar is number 811 in the series. Mari has participated in previous brown bags stretching back to at least 1992, when she edited Called from Within, Early Women Lawyers of Hawaii, an important collection of biographies of those who practiced law before statehood, published in the Center's biography monograph series. So this is not her first rodeo with important and significant women of Hawaii. When the Center was also producing the Biography Hawaii television series, Mari was one of our on-camera authorities for the life of Harriet Bauslag, who knew many of the women you will hear about today very well. And when we began putting together the Value of Hawaii series of essay collections in 2010, Mari not only wrote the essay on education for the first volume, over 10,000 copies in print, but she was also integral to our discussions of who should write the other essays. She also contributed a stunning essay for Value of Hawaii 3, Hulihia the Turning, which has now been downloaded over 10,000 times. And with her partner, Chuck Lawrence, they have, over the years, created at their home and elsewhere a nexus for progressive activist politics, art, cinema, and debate here in Hawaii. In her presentation today, you will recognize strands of all of these devotions. I would only add that in keeping with the Brown Bag series, you should note the autobiographical dimensions of her project, as well as the biographical, as in prosographical aspects of it as well. Prosopography, she has collected and proclaimed the lives of several remarkable women tied to her by dedication, courage, friendship, and genealogy. Finally, and maybe most important of all, I urge all of you to get to the Aupuni Gallery in the next few weeks to see the show that she will be telling us about today. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Mari Matsuda.
Thank you, Craig. And thank you to Aupuni Space for showing this work. Please do visit the gallery if you would like to see it in person. We're having a poetry showcase this Saturday night. Excited about that. And on March 8th, we're going to close with having a conversation between historians of left politics of this period and activists who are trying to create the path to change today. And we've invited Christina Heatherton to that. If you don't know her book, Arise, I recommend it highly. Take a look. It's UC California, Berkeley Press. So I made this exhibit using scrap shipping materials. These women are from the era of sugar pine shipping oligarchies that controlled Hawaii, and the pallets represent globalization and all it brought to Hawaii. But also these women were raised during the Depression and they never wasted anything. So all the materials from this exhibit are things I salvaged. when you visit this work, there's a bronze bell that you can see in this image, and you can ring it to announce your presence and talk to these women. And I'm really excited that many people have already entered into the conversation by leaving messages at the gallery. So as Craig said, this is a prosography, and that means I'm looking at the life histories of a group of people placed side by side to see the parallels. And when I did that, I saw these women, most of them spoke more than one language. They had a home language, they spoke English in school, and they spoke Pidgin to their friends, Hawaiian Pidgin Creole. Most of them, because they were Pidgin speakers, were segregated in Hawaii's unique form of racial segregation that created English standard and non-English standard schools to keep working class kids, brown kids, separate from the elites. Ironically, because of this, when these women spoke in public, they sounded like 1940s movie stars. They had elegant enunciation, well practiced to overcome discrimination. They all grew up in the ashes of World War I, global disruption, time of revolution, and they came of age after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. They saw the rise of fascism. They saw the bombing of Hiroshima. Almost all of them had worked in the pineapple canneries, and most of them began working as children. Helen Kanahele was a professional hula dancer from age 6. Aiko Reinecke began working in the fields at age 8. My mother, Mari Matsuda, gathered keawe beans for 5 cents a bag. And the current keawe flour advocates tell me that 5 cents a bag is the lowest rate they ever heard for kids collecting in those burlap bags on the plantation. My mom also pulled the ropes that rocked lines of cradles in the Makawele plantation nursery, where the babies were kept while their mothers worked in the fields. She did all of that for second grade, early grade school years. Most of these women grew up barefoot. My mom got her first pair of shoes in high school. And they remembered what plantation rule looked like. The Lunas riding on horseback with riding crops, as Eileen Fujimoto said at her sentencing in the Hawaii 7 Smith Act trial. They beat our parents like animals. This was a time when the sugar companies picked the judges and picked the politicians. When I was a young lawyer, you could still talk to old timers who remembered this, that they would gather at the Pacific Club with their drinks and their cigars and laughingly decide who was going to be the next governor, the next representative of the territory in Congress. Growing up in these circumstances of inequality, one-party political rule, and deep poverty, of course, were seeds for radical politics. But the catalyst for that politics was the world of ideas. The next slide shows Hawaii Youth for Democracy. This was organized as part of the Youth for Democracy movement that was international and came about after fascists slaughtered students in Prague. This was the beginning of International Students' Day, which these women organized to celebrate on the UH campus, commemorating the slain students. Women were in charge because the men had left campus for war. And I think this was another factor, as I do my prosography, in answering the question, why so many women in front in left political leadership in this time? Women like Jean Sadako McKillop, the sweetheart of the UH campus, 1945. These are just a couple of pictures of her, but if you look at the 1945 yearbook, she's on many pages. She won every beauty contest, Relay Queen, Kapalapala Queen, Mayday Queen. And she was also a proud member of an alleged communist front, the Hawaii Youth for Democracy, half Hale, half Japanese, and 100% idealistic dreamer. Jean went on to become a theater director, lifelong advocate of peace, civil rights, environment. She was known for open records in government. That's one of the legacies she left behind. And the first woman to serve as lieutenant governor in the state of Hawaii. So supporting open government, land use planning, and basic liberal platform of the Democratic Party, why did this justify FBI witch hunting? Why was this so threatening? These were just women who took democracy seriously in 1945. That question, why were they a threat, is personal to me because my mother, Mari Matsuda, Jean's best friend, was president of Hawaii Youth for Democracy. And this group was ultimately red baited off campus because students became scared to join. The crazed allegation that these women were plotting the violent overthrow of the United States hides an important truth. These women posed a genuine threat to oligarchy. Jean and Kimi, when they were students, helped build the ILWU in Hawaii by volunteering as researchers for the Honolulu Record, a pro-labor weekly edited by an accused communist. They went door to door documenting conditions on the sugar plantations where the contract labor system kept workers one step ahead of enslavement. You couldn't leave if you worked on the plantation unless you worked off your debt to the company. And the pay was so low that few managed to work their way out of servitude. This was the debt for their boat ticket, their passage to Hawaii to escape poverty where they came from, but also the debt amassed in the company store perquisite system where you were not paid money, but paid in script that you used at the company store. And this was one of the first things that the ILW abolished when they got into power. While Jean and Kimi canvassed for the union, they studied labor history at a place called the Labor Canteen. So this was a CIO-funded hangout in downtown Honolulu, and it was an alternative to the racially segregated USO. So if you were a progressive GI, you went to the canteen, not to the USO. And students, labor organizers, progressive GIs would party there and study group there. Hewitt Guinier, who became the first professor of African American studies at Harvard, taught Black history at the labor canteen. Urged on by their friends, the Hawaii Youth for Democracy organized the International Student Day and also brought the segregated 372nd Infantry Chorus to campus. Here they are at Andrews Amphitheater. Jean and Kimi also helped found the new foundation's Marxist student journal that was published out of New York. If you look closely under staff, you'll see Carolyn Ogata, which was the name my mom went by there, on the editorial board, and Jean McKillop, student editor. I was delighted when I dug up old copies of New Foundations to see that every month they featured printmakers, Charles White, Antonio Fresconi. These are people who have inspired my own work. The next slide shows Charles White's image alongside a table of contents that gives you an idea of the kinds of things these students thought important to talk about. Hawaii Youth for Democracy developed an identity that stayed with them as fighters for peace, global independence movements, women's rights, fair wages and working conditions. This identity stayed with them even as McCarthyism silenced any inflection of Marxism. They were the people who opposed war, opposed poverty, supported racial equality. They called themselves internationalists and sought peace among all nations. They believed in democracy. They wanted every person's vote to count in Hawaii. And they believed in a government that supported the rights of all citizens, not just a few. Were they communists? There is no definitive answer to this question, but in the period in which they lived, believing in the things they believed in meant they were called communists and relentlessly harassed by the FBI and the sugar plantations. I have concluded that at least some of these women were members of the Communist Party. Aquan late in life was interviewed and said that was no secret. They were all lifelong advocates of better lives for the least advantaged. My mother, who was a veteran of what she called the popular fight against fascism, told me, liberal communists, we worked together. We didn't draw lines. When you hear immigrant communists in the 40s, you picture maybe an East Coast refugee. You don't picture a Korean woman in Hawaii. When you hear a radical organizer at the docks, you might picture a longshoreman who looks something like Marlon Brando. You don't picture a Hawaiian woman. Your internalized newsreel of left US history does not include these faces, but they were there. How could they not be? Their families were disrupted by war, poverty, land stealing, colonialism, and the chaos the modern machinery of empire spewed against around the planet, and they fought back. So this project makes an intervention in American studies and left history in order to include forgotten participants. It's important to say that I agree with the Kanaka Maoli position that the United States presence in Hawaii lacks legal and moral legitimacy. So I challenge an absence from the record of US history, even as I recognize that Hawaii is not, as Dr. Trask taught us, America. But I want to write a revision of US history to include these women, not because Hawaii is America, but because the red baiting these women endured is an American product. This screen shows a letter from Kohala Sugar to the university president, referencing an article in the papers citing a federal judge, a sitting judge, telling the university they've got a problem with Bolsheviks on campus and they've got to get the students under control. I love the politely worded tone of this letter, in which the CEO of the sugar company says, hey, my friend needs a job. I'm sure you're going to take his application seriously. And I hope you're paying attention to what your students are doing because Frank is upset. These subtle interventions really created a reign of terror in the era of sugar plantation control, because if you got on the blacklist, you couldn't get a job. One of my cousins visited the exhibit at Aupuni Space and told me for the first time that when her mother applied for a clerical job with the federal government, she was asked about her connections to my mother. Did you know that your sister-in-law is a communist? She was asked in her job interview. I actually don't know if my mother was a card-carrying communist, because I was taught that as a matter of principle, people of integrity will never ask and never answer the question, are you now or have you ever been? I now wish I had asked. And I do know that my mother had deep lifelong friendships with people associated with the Communist Party. She spoke of a fearless Korean American radical, whip smart, no nonsense, a gatherer of people. Her house had 100 steps to the front door, my mom recalled. And all the best parties were there. All the progressives ended up at Alice Hyun's. Here's a picture of Alice when I was sketching her on the palette. So this shows my process. First, I sketched onto the wood, and then I carved, and then I printed. Alice Hyun was the first Korean woman born in Hawaii. Her parents had endured torture and were exiled here as they struggled for independence from Japan for Korea. From Hawaii, they returned to Shanghai and attempted to form a government in exile. This was an international city where freedom fighters and refugees from around the world were exchanging ideas, and Alice was introduced to revolutionary ideas and Marxism there. Her family returned to Hawaii, and she continued to support independence while connecting with radical labor organizers in Hawaii. As World War II approached, Alice and her communist friends, did you hear the crack in my voice? There's so much shame and things that are hidden about this period, that these people never openly identified as communists after the 40s. But they did bury a stash of communist literature, Alice and her friends, and it was dug up by the FBI. And this was splashed across the front pages in a sensationalized reporting about the buried communist stash discovered in East Oahu. One war ended and another began, and Alice was deeply distressed. Her father, Reverend Sun Hyun, was writing letters to the local papers protesting the division of Korea and begging that the United States stop the bombing of civilians. Let the Korean people decide for themselves how to run their country, he pleaded. Alice was determined to help, and she left Hawaii through Czechoslovakia, which was a friendly nation, through which she could enter to North Korea. She wanted to rebuild her homeland. At first, she was recognized as a hero in North Korea because of her family's work, risking their lives for Korean independence. But Cold War paranoia set in, and it meant that the workers' paradise that she hoped for had become treacherous. This brilliant woman who came to help North Korea navigate its way out of the Cold War was executed as an American spy. I am here to tell you that Alice was not a spy sent to destroy North Korea. I am positive of this because I knew her cohort. They were dreamers in pursuit of a dream. Alice went as a sincere friend of Korea, but it is sadly predictable that as the Cold War drove both sides of her divided homeland to repressive extremes, her independence of thought would prove too threatening. When I drew Alice's face, I wanted her eyes to show intelligence, determination, and sorrow. I drew an edge at her the edge of her mouth. Is it a smile? I didn't want to make it too sad, not the kind of sad that destroys hope, because her life reflected so much hope, or she would not have made that journey so far away from her beloved family in Hawaii. I want everyone to know Alice and to know she believed in a world without rich or poor, without war, without violence, without division, a world so different from the one that killed her. I have a bit of time, so I'm going to introduce one more person, Helen Kanahele, and this is my drawing of her on the palette. When I began, I was troubled that there were 8 Asian women in my pantheon, but no Hawaiians. So as a feminist scholar, next slide is Helen, I was taught to interrogate absence. I examined the 1945 UH yearbook and saw that Chinese, Korean, and Japanese women, that's the one, dominated the pages, but very few Hawaiian names appear. If education was one route to left consciousness, it was not equally available to Hawaiians. As I explained my speculation about this Kanaka absence to leading scholar of Hawaiian intellectual history, Dr. Noenoe Silva, she frowned, troubled by my quick jump to an explanation of absence. Dr. Silva, who knows that Hawaiians of the 1940s were political actors of many ideological stripes, told me, keep looking for her. Don't assume she doesn't exist. Go to the archives. I am grateful for the commanding voice of my diminutive friend. I didn't want to disappoint her. I started with the HUAC listings of people targeted for investigation and thrown in with communists and fellow travelers. I saw a name I had not seen before, Helen Kanahele. Further inquiry revealed a picket line stalwart, union maid who never was afraid of goons, ginks, company thinks, and most significantly, red baiters. Helen was an orphan who was sent off on a worldwide adventure when she was just 6 years old. She danced in the Ike Fernandez traveling show on Heiwadori in Japan. She witnessed Jim Crow on the US continent and held that troubling memory her entire life of races separated off as though Blackness was a contaminant. Her voice is one of supreme confidence as she tells these stories. You can see them on microfiche at Hamilton Library. One day she went down to the docks to have lunch with her brother, a striking stevedore, and she had to break through a gauntlet of angry white women waving brooms to sweep out the Bolsheviks. Helen was incensed. She joined the picket line and she became a labor organizer. She also organized to form the Democratic Party in Hawaii, or build the party up from a tiny, ineffectual thing to a real power. She also helped start the movement that ended the death penalty in Hawaii. She was a tireless drummer for support in the Major's Palakiku defense that saved the lives of 2 impoverished Hawaiians who were snapped from the gallows at the 11th hour. A story that has been told at Brown biographies before. Most significantly to this project, Helen helped raise funds for the defense of the Hawaii 7. Eileen Fujimoto, one of the women in this exhibit, was part of that group, the only woman defendant. And Helen was one of the few people who wasn't afraid to associate with them and raise money for their defense. I am not a communist, she said, but I believe people have a right to be one if they want to be. She also fought the loyalty oath that was proposed for the Democratic Party and would have kept the communists, the best organizers, out of the party. Helen and Rachel Psyche fought that from the floor at the Democratic Party convention, and they won. From the gaze of this century, several questions arise from the lives of women like Helen. How did they, in the pre-second wave feminist era, develop such a sense of themselves as powerful people, leaders, doers, makers of worlds? How did they come to ally with the most feared ideology of their time? And what happened to their struggle? Why do we know so little about it? What remains of their dream? I have unearthed a paradox in my own thinking. On the one hand, I see these women as prescient outliers. And yet, as I examined their lives, the question became less, how did they become so amazing? And more, how could they have become anything else? Growing up in families, counting the budget by pennies, nickels, and dimes. Watching their parents treated as expendable commodities, or in Alice's case, tortured for their dream of a free Korea. You might welcome a world in which workers are treated fairly and people are free from despotic overlords. If you watch fascist armies slaughter students you identify with, or atom bombs fall on your relatives, you might consider war evil, and you might fight for a world without war. Add to these material realities the allure of a movement that emphasized good parties, solidarity, and smart conversations with international perspectives. Communists comprised, if you were a college kid going downtown to the labor canteen, the smartest, most sophisticated, attractive people you could possibly encounter in Honolulu. When Jean and Kimi left for graduate school in New York City, the labor canteen contacts soon had them partying with Harry Belafonte, Pete Seeger, Lorraine Hansberry, Alice Childress, Paul Robeson, and a huge tribe of the most fascinating humans. My mom would tell me these stories when I was a kid, and I would kind of, as you do, just say, yeah, Mom, not really knowing how much was exaggeration. But I can tell you that my mother did introduce me to Paul Robeson when he was a very old man and I was a child. And my son, Paul, is named after him. The risks these women faced, the harassment, blacklisting, social program were real. But so were the rewards of a lifetime in the company of brilliant, passionate people who live the values of deep humanism. The people labeled red were not planning the violent overthrow of the United States. Theirs was an ideology of love of their fellow human beings, called solidarity, and a belief that human dignity matters. For someone like Alice Hyun, raised devoutly Christian with a deep resentment of imperialist Japan, that bully who had stolen her country and tortured her mother, it was not a big leap from the teachings of Jesus Christ to a belief in a socialist form of government that would provide for all and treat all people as stewards of themselves. This is the Communist Party platform of 1945 that I found in the archives. You'll see a note that it says it was found on the UH campus. What were they fighting for? Free public education. In my research, I saw that Rachel Psyche had to drop out of school because she couldn't afford the $9 tuition that public schools charged. Affordable housing, lowering taxes for workers and raising taxes for the wealthy, raising the minimum wage. These demands might sound familiar to people involved in various struggles today. Large numbers of people were attracted to this vision. The communist-leaning Honolulu Record and similar papers in Japanese and Filipino languages had thousands of subscribers, exposing them to the idea of a worker-led democracy. I have come to see these women less as unicorns and more as perfectly predictable exemplars of history from below. They join the people Peter Linebaugh and Marcus Rediker describe in their book, The Many-Headed Hydra. The reality throughout the modern era is that workers in factory, in field, on ship, those toiling under the lash, treated as chattels, while others raked in wealth beyond belief, did not consent to the systems that exploited them, and quite naturally came to favor a more equal distribution of wealth and power. The reason you have not heard of these women is that their stories were deliberately buried during the Cold War. You were not intended to learn from them. It's the same censorship that's going on now, trying to keep Black history and critical race theory out of our schools and universities. Our foremothers knew how to fight back. It starts with the simple act of talking to one another, as we are doing here. This is what I see. What did you see? What is not working in your life? What would a better life look like? The women in this art exhibit taught me that this is what you do. You go door to door. You go back week after week. You build trust. This is how they ended sugar plantation control in Hawaii. Kanahele, with her broad smile and her generous confidence, one who had danced around the world at age 6, knew how to do this. And somewhere, right now as I speak, someone is doing this. On behalf of the radical women of Hawaii, circa 1945, I would like to tell you that the world they dream of is going to happen. In that world, no one goes hungry. The planet stays green and healthy. Everyone knows care and safety. There is no war, and there is lots of music, art, and dancing. I'd like to tell you in closing what it's like to live your life in the struggle. Here's Rachel Psyche. As a young girl in the 1940s, organizing pickets for war bonds. And on the right, there she is in the middle of this picture, picketing to free the Wilmington 10, which was a civil rights group that was in jail on trumped up charges in 1977. And on the right, there's me, a young girl, I was organized by these women into so many political actions. Often when I was, in my mind, too busy to go, they'd drag me out to the action. And their lives were full of joy and meaning. They got to hang out with the cool kids of every decade from 1940 right up to the end of their lives because of their calling as organizers. And I close with my parents. This is a picture of them in the 90s at one of the last demonstrations they took part of in before dementia took over their lives. It's protesting the building of a military base at Henoko against the wishes of the Okinawan people. They were not, by the way, the oldest people at this demonstration. And here's a check that Craig showed me. This is the reparations that Aiko Reinecke got when the state of Hawaii admitted that it was wrong to fire her from her job for her political beliefs. And maybe Craig can tell us more about this check. This is the day McCarthyism ended, leaving us free to relearn what these women knew. Our foremothers left us with a legacy of change. If you act on behalf of the 99% against the oligarchs, you will be called a communist. But these women have already won that battle for you. Let them call you whatever name they want. What they are saying is get back, don't ask for your share, stay quiet, be thankful for crumbs. I am honored to have known women who laughed at that and lived good and memorable lives. And I'm so happy to share their lives with you. Thank you. I think we're moving on to discussion. Thank you, Craig. Thank you, Marika. Thank you, Caroline. And all of you who are in attendance. I'm a little intimidated because really some of our most amazing scholars in Honolulu and elsewhere are on. So Craig.
Well, I'm not even going to say anything right off the bat. I'm just going to repeat two of the comments that have already come up. This is from Don Murray. I already know that this is the most powerful and moving biography talk I have ever listened to. Thank you for making it happen. I don't have to say anything. Blessed to have known most of these women, not always realizing how lucky I was. Will say that they were all so generous, kind, welcoming, and amazing mentors. Will be ever grateful for the knowledge and training they shared. That's from Nancy Alec, Hawaii People's Fund legend. So I'll start with those two comments. I'll also provide a little bit of explanation of that check. Caroline, could you possibly put that back up on the screen again?
Yes.
We found this check when we were doing, and I was working with Mari on this, when we did the Biography Hawaii documentary on Harriet Bauslag, who was one of those notable women lawyers of Hawaii. And she ended up defending a number of the Hawaii Seven, and also was Palakiko and Major's defense. She lived an absolutely remarkable life as the lawyer for the ILWU and various other matters. One of the things she did was she advocated for many union members and also people who had suffered under the oligarchy. This check is one that I actually have on my wall because whenever I'm feeling particularly down about what's going on in the world, I look at it. If you look at the date, what you will see is it's 1978. Aiko and John Reinecke were essentially barred from any kind of private or public business or employment from about 1948 on. Aiko was dumped from Waialae Elementary. John was dumped from Farrington, both as alleged communists. As far as I know, 30 years later, the state legislature of Hawaii actually paid them reparations. I don't know if there's another check like this in the United States where people who were directly suffered or persecuted by the government and by the society for alleged communism were ever compensated for their suffering. The state legislature of Hawaii in 1978, you will see, gave the two of them $250,000. and you'll see Harriet's name on there as well too. We found a photocopy of this check when we were going through Harriet's archives. It was one of the things that she sort of kept. I think she was probably pretty proud of it as well too. I have heard, and I think this is the case, that John and Aiko used some of this money to deal with the longstanding debts they had to deal with, but that part of it, I believe, and Nancy can probably tell us about this, part of this money actually went into helping found and shape the Hawaii People's Fund, which gives you an idea if even when they were being granted reparations, the Reineke's impulse was to immediately share and move that out and contribute to progressive causes. So that's what that check is. Now, this is from Joe Wilson. Thank you for offering a window into this hidden history of Hawaii. Does the topic of sexuality, more specifically same-sex attraction, relationships, intersect with any of the stories of such women during this time in Hawaii? I am asking because I am part of an emerging effort looking to investigate, document, and help elevate the lives, experiences, struggles, and inspiration of gender and sexual minorities in Hawaii across the generations.
Yes. I was about to say, well, not really, but then I remembered a story that my mother, Mari Matsuda, told me that when she left Hawaii to go to Colombia, she was, of course, in the cheapest part of the boat on the bottom where the food is terrible. But she ate first-class food every day because she knew the guys in the Marine cooks and stewards. So this is a very interesting political formation, which was gay men on top deck who were hired because they knew how to ho'omale the rich ladies, to keep them happy. And below deck, it was a motley crew of every race, but they were organized by the very most left wing of the labor movement, which was communist dominated at that time. So my mother knew all these guys. So she was eating first class food while she was riding in the bottom of the boat because of her gay friends who were bringing her goodies. So that's just one story that I recall. Many of these women lived unconventional lives. The closet was a pretty deep thing, so I honestly do not know if any of them personally, internally identified as non-straight. But I do see, like, this is a prosography, so you look at the group, that most of them did not live kind of Ozzie and Harriet lives. My mom had a very happy, long-lived marriage, but among progressive women, I would say that was an exception. So kind of the heterosexual norm, I don't think dominated the left experience of this time, even though because of the closet, there's just a lot we're never going to know.
Okay, Dean and Noe would both like, this is Dean Sauronino and Noe Silva. They would like to ask a question, I think on camera and with the mic on, which of course we can accommodate. So Caroline, could you set that up?
Oh, can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, great. Thank you so much, Mari, for that amazing presentation and for the exhibition. This is such powerful work, and it really helps us to really understand just how radical the 40s was in Hawaii, and all of the people who made a lot of the material things that we take for granted today possible. And so in that period of the 40s, there's just so many different kinds of absences. So like, I think the absences that you're pointing to is incredibly profound and so generative. But there's also the absence of the conversations about the overthrow in 1893. And, I've done some work on that, not a lot. It was just, a few chapters, but in a book. But, in 1946, for instance, Kamakila Campbell, and she's a Campbell, so it complicates the people who you're talking about, absolutely. But, she testifies at Iolani Palace in front of a crowd of 800 people, testifying on January 17th, the date of the overthrow, in opposition to statehood, right? And so there's a way, I think, that even though she was a Campbell, she was speaking on behalf of a lot of people who were applauding as she gave her testimony. And then I think in 47, you mentioned the Honolulu Record, which is just one of the, I think, best newspapers in Hawaii. Sorry, not the best, but
It can be the best.
in that time, possibly. But when Koji Ariyoshi, who was who helped found the paper and was running the paper, was being tried under as a part of the Hawaii 7, one of the things that they do in the Honolulu Record is they talk about the overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom. And they talk about that as the violent overthrow of a government, right? And kind of trying to point parallels between what's happening with the Smith Act and the overthrow, and the ways in which it was really this kind of contrived discourse meant to minimize dissent. And this is just kind of a long-winded way of kind of trying to figure out how to position that form of radicalism in relation to the question that you posed, referencing Haunani K, about the question of whether it's occupation or settler colonialism. And so, one of the things that Patrick Wolf talks about, and this is also in the 40s, is that he says, that the partitioning of Palestine was meant to contend with anti-Semitism, that in his formulation, that Zionism was a response to anti-Semitism. And it's nowhere near comparable, but I do think there is something to be said about the ways that statehood was seen as a way of resolving a lot of the anti-Asian sentiment and a lot of these issues that were that we talk about when we mention the 1940s and those movements. And so I'm just trying to figure out how to position the women that you're talking about in relation to statehood, and how it kind of, how to make sense of that moment, because it's not separate moments. Like in the 40s, they were talking about the overthrow. There were Hawaiians who courageously and were being blacklisted for speaking about in opposition to statehood. And it's just it's a complicated question. I'm not sure if I'm being clear, but I'm just trying to figure out how to position the speaker, the amazing people you're talking about, and some of the other folks who are also doing that kind of similar work.
Oh, I love this, Dean, because you asked the hardest question first, and my brain's kind of going like this. So I'm going back to Dr. Trask, Dr. Haunani K. Trask. She was a big fan of Frantz Fanon. And I think there's a way in which anti-colonial forms of nationalism are useful to think about as separate from nationalism without that anti-colonial progressive internationalist politics. And I think it's if that slide that we showed about the Communist Party platform, one of the platforms is statehood. So right away, that's going to be in opposition to the important recognition of Hawaiian sovereignty. And I think this is a particular moment in people's political development, right? So many of these women lived a long, long, long life. I know that my own mother, by the end of her life, was a strong supporter of all Native Hawaiian movements, including the sovereignty movement. And I think that's true for probably most of the women in my cohort that lived a long, long, long life. But in that particular moment, when you're trying to get rid of the big five, like in structuralist terms, statehood was seen as part of that. Like, who was opposing statehood? The same people that eventually opposed the Civil Rights Act and basically anything progressive that happened in the United States in the 20th century was opposed by the people who opposed statehood. But I think on reflection, many people today who would have supported statehood in that period because it was seen as progressive, it was giving the vote to brown people, okay, understand that this stealing of a nation in Hawaii needs rectification, and that's not an impossible dream. I think the other thing that was going on in that particular period, including for a lot of Hawaiians, is it seemed like an impossible dream. And I think there's much more of a sense now in this broken world that we have to ask for everything, because we're either going to lose everything or we're going to get everything. Because of the urgency of climate disruption and economic collapse that we're headed for, that the return of the Hawaiian nation is not a dream, right? And so I think there are different kinds of nationalisms, and I think that's what you're getting at, that forces that in some ways were very conservative were keeping alive this dream of the lost Hawaiian nation, and thank goodness that they did, right? People, in spite of every effort to destroy Hawaiian language and culture and personal sovereignty as well as legal sovereignty, it survived, and it's still here, and it's coming back. But it's really complicated. And I think part of it is understanding kind of structuralist Marxist intellectual thought in that moment in the 1940s was both liberating and constraining in ways that I think we need to have a continuing discussion about. So this is a to be continued, because you're making my brain hurt. Thank you.
Okay, we've got a question from Issei Matsumoto. Thank you for this moving presentation, Professor Matsuda. I'm a history PhD student researching post-war labor history in Hawaii, so these beautiful stories were of particular interest to me. Did any of these women ever have any involvement in organizing the post-war service industry in Hawaii? Thank you.
Yeah. Rachel, Helen were union organizers. I would direct you to Helen Kanahele's life story in particular. I could just touch the surface on these women. They did so many amazing things in their lifetime. So I'm actually really interested in what you find when you do your research and eventually publish it, because so much of this story is untold. So thank you.
Okay. A couple of things. I was wondering, this is in some ways a teaser for the gallery show. You gave us really a remarkable insight into two, and I know you were being selective there, but given the fact that it is a prosopography, could you just tell us a little bit about the other women that you didn't get a chance to mention, just so that we can fully register sort of the kind of range and want to find out more?
Caroline, if you could put the gallery slide back up, we can see their faces. Aiko Reinecke was amazing, lifelong activist. This picture, Hawaii Youth for Democracy, includes Jenny Yukimura. And I wanted to include her both because she was so close to Jean and Kimi, but also to show the range of ideas. You know, nobody would call Jenny a radical. She was a good liberal. She was a social worker, the kind of person who showed up for church and community at every event. She is second row, third from the right. But she was not afraid to associate with these women who were being red baited in the 1940s. And in her lifetime, just helped so many people and so many families in her work through, you know, things like, you know, the League of Women Voters or her church and her work as a social worker. Her work in land use struggles on Kauai just to maintain beach access for citizens and keep the hotels from being built right on the beach. This kind of like good citizen Democratic Party stalwart participated in every year in campaigns to get Democrats elected. Also associated with these women who were radicals. If we could go back to the gallery slide, who else is up there? Well, Aquan McElrath, Craig has reels and reels of information about her. Eileen Fujimoto, who was the only defendant in the Smith Act trials who was a woman, tireless organizer for civil rights and human rights over her lifetime, but also really, really suffered because of the Smith Act trials. You know, I've got like 300 relatives, so it was so surprising to me that one of my aunties who's not, you know, nowhere involved in politics was, my cousin told me, you know, denied a job because of her association with my mom. So, you know, just knowing these women could mean that you didn't work. So that made it so hard for people like Eileen, whose face was on the front page of the newspaper, and the Smith Act trial went on for months. So the social opprobrium and ostracism that these women faced really scarred them and deprived us of a lifetime of the knowledge that they could have shared with us if they were openly discussing their politics. But they never stopped working. So, you know, Eileen organized me and made me show up for all kinds of things. I mean, I remember cooking for potlucks when I was trying to study for my law school exams because Eileen was running a fundraiser. That's the kind of people they were. They called you and you couldn't say no. They knew how to organize. Rachel Psyche, lifetime worker, organizer, many, many activist children. People told me this when they came to the gallery exhibit, have Christmas stockings that she knitted. And I'm proud to say that my Christmas stocking that she knitted in 1957 was the very first one she made. And my Auntie Ruth taught her how to turn the and just a warm, loving person, you know, always feeding you. The first person who ever fed me baklava was Rachel Psyche, making it way back in the 60s before it was, you know, a known and popular thing served in restaurants. They just loved life, loved food, loved hiking, doing things, feeding people. And the idea that they were accused of plotting the violent overthrow of the United States is just laughable. And yet many lives were ruined by that accusation. You know, who knows what these women could have become if they weren't red baited, and what they left a strong legacy. But, you know, I have to tell you about them because a lot of people don't know about them because of that red baiting.
There's an interesting force behind this question from Don Moray. Is Rachel Psyche in any way related to Speaker Psyche?
I don't think so, but I don't know.
Got the tone. I also wanted to mention, we've just put him back into the chat, because obviously one of the things about this remarkable presentation is it's a wonderful teaser for the actual gallery display, which is now up on your screen. And I just wanted to point out it's running till March the 8th. All right, Wednesdays and Saturdays from 11 to 3, Fridays 3 to 7 in Aupuni Space. And also there are other events that Mari was mentioning, which are going to be taking place near the end of the run, that are going to be wonderful formats for poetry, for further discussion about political action, and basically bringing to a close this sort of multimedia presentation. We could probably entertain one more question or comment if someone has. Okay, and if not, I would just like to join everyone, I think, in thanking you very much, Mari, for this presentation and from the Center for Biographical Research, your long-standing commitment to recognizing that foregrounding the importance of individual people's lives is one of the ways that we can understand so many different things about the world that we're living in. So thank you again for this and for everything you do.
Thank you, Craig. Thank you everyone for attending, and I look forward to seeing you at the exhibit and hearing your comments. Please leave a comment in the book that's at the exhibit for interaction.
Hui hou.